Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Today I'm doing a book review by a book called The Anarchy by William Dalrymple. It's a history of the East India Company. As you may know, the East India Company got a foothold in India and slowly from there went on to actually take over parts of the territory of India from the Mughal Empire in the 18th century. Aurangzeb, the last great Mughal emperor, died in 1707, and after his time the Mughal Empire went into a period of decline, quite rapid decline, and during this time, for about 100 years, was a period known as the Anarchy in India, as the Mughal Empire was in severe decline and disintegration. Many different warlords and different factions and different people rose up throughout India to proclaim their autonomy from the Mughal Empire, stake out territory and fight one another and so on. I've read several books by William Dalrymple in the past. He's a well-known author on the subject of the history of the British in India, the Mughals, and the East India Company and the British Raj. His books are generally very good. I think he does try very hard to be balanced in his approach to the history of the British in India. However, he obviously is a British English person himself, and he can't completely shake off deep sort of affinity that he feels towards his ancestors and so on that were in India as part of the British Empire. There are generally two schools of thought regarding the British in Empire and the British and the other European colonial empires generally as well. One school of thought, both schools of thought agree that the British and the other European colonial empires did a huge amount of horrific things around the world, including India. But one school of thought tries to look at it in some of the positives that the British also did. And they talk about things like, modernizing the country, i.e. Bringing it up to speed with European achievements, bringing in railways. Railways is normally one of the main things they seem to always talk about. The other school of thought is a lot more critical of the British and their presence in India, and disputes that the sort of positives that are supposed to have come from the British. One of the good books from those that are more critical is a book by Shashi Tharoor called Inglorious Empire. So I recommend people to read that as well. I think William Dalrymple tries to sort of stay a little bit in the middle of these two camps, which is fair enough. So this book looks in a lot of detail at the 1700s and focuses on the East India Company and how it slowly started taking over parts of India from the Muslims until eventually by about the end of the 18th century, pretty much the whole of India is under the control of the British through the East India Company. So one of the interesting things, and the book highlights this as well, is that the East India Company is a company. It's a corporation. It's actually a trading company. It's not acting as part of the British nation or the British Empire. It is literally a corporation, and it's been described as the mother of corporations. It's one of the first of the major corporations that arose in Europe. If we look at the history of corporations in Europe, and obviously this is very closely tied into capitalism and the colonial empires. We see the East India Company is sort of like the pioneering. It's not actually the first company, but it's one of the very early ones. And it also marks a new type of structure within the corporate finance business world, the limited liability company. So this is a really important departure from previous arrangements. It means that the people who own the company, the shareholders, do not have personal liability for the debts that the company may get into. So if the company gets into huge amounts of debts and goes bankrupt, for example, that will only come from the company's finances, not from the owners of the company. It doesn't go to their personal wealth. So this may be a unique innovation. I don't know if this has ever happened before in history that we know of. Certainly throughout Islamic history, in Islamic law, they always had companies, they had shareholders. You could have shares in a company, you could part own a company, but ultimately, as owners of a company, the liability would come back on you. So there's a type of responsibility and accountability. With the rise of the limited company, where you find now that accountability for the owners is very, very much diminished. The reason why this type of limited liability corporation came about was because a small kingdom like England did not have the resources, to send out large trade expeditions. So they wanted to send out these trade expeditions to India and the Spice Islands, what is now Indonesia, and the Far East, because they were desperate to get the products so they could trade back in Europe. But the limited liability company meant that lots of people could put money together because these were very risky endeavors. And then, they could, because these ships would sail out and they would take maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 years or more before they come back. And there was a lot of dangers along the routes, piracy, all sorts of things. So there was no guarantee that the ships would ever make it back. So a particular individual didn't want to risk part of their wealth or all of their wealth on such a risky venture. But with the limited liability companies, people could put their money together, and that way they could share the risk. But also, if things went disastrously wrong, their personal wealth that was not invested in the company would be safe. So the East India Company is the mother of corporations. Now, the interesting thing is, obviously, these trading expeditions, these ships were setting out from England, traveling all the way around Africa, over to India and the Far East. It would take, like as I said, it would take a year or more just to get there, and then they would stay there for a year and come back. Typically 3 years a round trip. So these expeditions used to also have a military component. They had soldiers with them, cannons, because of all the dangers that they may face. Now, once the East India Company starts trading in India, it does so with the permission from the Mughal Emperor at the time. And as was the normal way with the European traders to the Far East, the British start establishing trading ports, and they fortified them. And interestingly, they start building up a small army, and they start training Indians in the British way of warfare. Now, by this time, the Europeans and the British especially had become world leaders in military weaponry and tactics. They had been slowly getting ahead of the Muslim world as well. So as Dalrymple points out, the interesting thing is here now you have a corporation, a trading company, but it's slowly building up its own private army. And then as time goes on, slowly, the Mughal Empire, after Aurangzeb dies in 1707, the Mughal Empire goes into a slow process of decline and decay, and various rebellions start arising throughout the Mughal India. People start declaring themselves autonomous from the Mughal Empire. And the British, the East India Company is there. It starts, it becomes a player. And anyway, it's a long process, which I'm not going to go into the details of. But gradually and slowly, the East India Company starts taking more and more of the territory, starting from Bengal, where it was initially based in Calcutta. The Bengal, today's Bangladesh region, was actually the most richest and prosperous region of India. And India was the most prosperous and wealthy nation in the whole world. The Mughal emperor was no doubt the richest man in the world of his time. It's just really interesting to see how, the Bengal was the most richest and fertile land of that period and before as well, throughout the Middle Ages and even in ancient times. So the British, they completely devastated the economy of India. People have estimated now that, as I said, India was the most wealthy land in the whole world, and people have estimated at least a quarter to a third of the world's economic output, what's nowadays called GDP, global GDP, came from India. India was one of the great manufacturing centers of the world at the time. The Indian goods were completely desired after throughout the world. Then the British came in, and after 200 years of British rule, by the time the British left, the economic portion of global output for India was down to about 4%. So from over 25% down to 4%. And the reasons for that were that the British did not really make India their home. They didn't think of it at home. The Mughals had come in as a foreign power, but the Mughals had become Indian. They had settled in India, they had become part of India. And in fact, it was the Mughals that actually, for the first time, made India into a unified land. And, so in other words, the wealth, the fabulous wealth that the Mughals had, it was Indian money, and it was kept within India, within the economy. The British experience was completely different. The British were seeing India as a place to drain resources from, to exploit, to suck out the wealth and bring it back to England and Britain. And this is exactly what they did. And there were massive famines. Millions of Indian people died in these famines, in the Bengal, for example. And these deaths could easily have been averted just by simple distribution of food to these people, but the East India Company was not willing to do that. So this is how the East India Company slowly starts spreading throughout India. The power and the wealth of the East India Company was enormous. When it starts taking over this territory in India, remember we said India was the richest land, so now the British are getting all of these taxes from the land. The British are also growing things like opium and selling it to China. So they're making huge amounts of profits for this corporation. And this corporation, the East India Company, becomes so powerful and wealthy that it starts gaining a huge amount of influence in the British Parliament by literally buying out MPs back in England and back in Scotland Um, so the East India Company is one of the most powerful elements of the entire British colonial empire during this period. Often, the East India Company is defeating Muslim and other Indian armies that are much greater in size. And the reason for that, part of it is the technological superiority, the weapons that the British are constantly improving their weaponry, and also their military tactics, how they're able to use the new weapons, the muskets, the guns, the cannons, in very tight formations and military drilling and so on. That comes across. It should also be not taken too far, this idea, because it's also clear that the Indians and the Muslims in India were very quickly trying to take on these European advances in military technology and military tactics. So, for example, some of the Mughal leaders, like Tipu Sultan, who were fighting against the British, they were having French military advisors and French military experts come in, because the French were, remember, the major conflict during this time is actually between the British and the French. Throughout the 18th century, these two empires are completely having wars and conflicts, and when they're not at war, they're in a state of rivalry all the time. So the French are very happy to help the Mughals and the other groups like the Hindu Marathas within India to fight against the British. So the technological advantage is not the only aspect here. Another aspect that does come through, which I found interesting, was that the Mughal Empire is weakened throughout this period by other Muslims attacking it, by other Muslim forces. And one of these was Ahmad Shah Durrani from Afghanistan. So we see throughout this period that Ahmad Shah Durrani, who's a warlord, a commander, he's sweeping down into India many times and conquering territory, but also he makes a point of sending his armies into the Mughal capital, Delhi, and sacking Delhi and looting it and taking the money, the wealth. And this happens again and again, almost on a yearly basis. Because Delhi, don't forget, the capital of the Mughal Empire, is a huge, wealthy city, maybe the most wealthy city in the world. So Ahmad Shah Durrani is sending in his armies. The Quran talks about forbids the killing Muslim. In fact, it may be the greatest sin after shirk. If we look at the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم ومن يقتل مؤمنا متعمدا فجزاؤه جهنم خالدا فيها وغضب الله عليه ولعنه وأعد له عذابا أليما. Whoever kills a believer, whoever kills a mu'min, a believer, intentionally, then his recompense is Jahannam, the hellfire. He will abide therein forever, and the ghadab of Allah is upon him, the anger of Allah is upon him, and the curse of Allah is upon him, and Allah has prepared for him a painful punishment. So this is like one of the few, or maybe the only instance in the Quran where this particular sin is linked to such an extreme punishment. Not just Jahannam, but the ghadab of Allah and the la'na of Allah, and on top of that another more of a painful punishment. وَعَدَّ لَهُ عَذَابًا عَلِيمًا. So the killing of a believer is one of the most greatest sins possible. And the ayah even says, Khalidan fiha, he will be in Jahannam forever. And the ulama had to have long discussions about this, because if a Muslim goes to Jahannam, they're not meant to stay in Jahannam forever, no matter what sins they've committed. So, however, that's what the ayah says. But it basically indicates the severe seriousness of this particular sin and this offense in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Also Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, لا يتخذ المؤمنون الكافرين أولياء من دون المؤمنين. And in many other ayahs of similar as well, that the believers should not take disbelievers as allies. The believers should not take disbelievers as allies who are not believers. وَمَنْ يَفْعَلْ ذَلِكَ فَلَيْسَ مِنَ اللَّهِ شَيْئًا. Whoever does that, he will have nothing with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. إِلَّا أَن تَتَّقُوا مِنْهُمْ تُقَاتًا. Unless it is done in a state of fear and necessity. وَيُحَذِّرُكُمُ اللَّهُ نَفْسَهُ. Allah warns you from Himself. Allah warns you from Himself. So here we see during this period, we see Muslims allying with non-Muslims, and the Mughals are just as much to blame as anyone else. We see the Mughals sometimes allying with the Hindu Marathas or with the British as well at times. We see Ahmad Shah Durrani coming and killing Muslims, raiding Delhi. Now, he did, and there's no, he didn't have any sort of higher purpose as well. Some could argue other cases, like for example Ottomans fighting against certain Muslims, but they could have argued that they were doing it for the sake of expanding the peace and the security of the borders of the Ottoman Empire. At least there's some sort of justification here. This is blatantly, raiding into Delhi, not trying to acquire the territory or to expand the borders of his empire, but simply to loot and pillage the wealth of other Muslims. So, and we shouldn't also put all the blame or negative on Ahmad Shah Durrani. I think, this was actually, by this time, this was one of the general malaise of the Muslims, whether in India and other places, that this was generally now, they were no longer regarding the sanctity of Muslim blood, and they were no longer regarding the commandments of the Quran. So when you start disregarding these type of general commandments that are in the Quran, how can then Muslims expect to have victory upon victory? And why do Muslims then ask the question, how were we defeated by disbelievers, when we're not even following the clear and very strong commandments and prohibitions in the Quran? Now, the other thing which I think is interesting and we should highlight is that as Muslims, some Muslims tend to try to blame the rulers. So you want to blame Ahmad Shah Durrani, but what about the people who are in the army of Ahmad Shah Durrani, the Muslims who are in his army, the soldiers? Why are they supporting him? Why are they going along with him? Now people might say, but they just have to follow commands, but that's actually not true. And this is something I've come to realize, that the leader of a people comes from the people. The leader of a people is a representative of those people, and he's a part of those people. That's just a fact and a reality. So, people like to say, it's the leaders in the Muslim countries that are all wrong and corrupt, and and the masses are good, and we need to get rid of the leaders and we'll solve all our problems. But that's, in my opinion, that's not what history teaches us, right? I mean, look, for example, as a counter-example to that, look at the early Sahaba. Now, when Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu was fighting against Sayyidina Muawiyah radiallahu anhu, this was the first, one of the first civil war in Islam. So the army of Ali was fighting the army of Muawiyah. Both of them are Sahaba. We believe as Sunnis that Sayyidina Ali ultimately was in the right, but that Muawiyah was sincerely believing he was doing the right thing. But Ali was actually in the right. And anyway, during the battle, the two armies are fighting, and Muawiyah's side is losing and is about to lose the battle. So suddenly the soldiers from Muawiyah's army, they come out and they've got pages of Quran tied to their spears. And they put these in front of the other army and they say, let the Quran decide between us, let the Quran decide between us. Now Sayyidina Ali, he realizes that they're just doing this so they can prevent a complete defeat and surrender. It's in other words a trick. So he tells his army to continue fighting until the other side surrender completely. But his soldiers, they can't raise the sword against the Quran. When they see the Quran on the spears, they refuse to fight, and they put down their swords. So this just shows how, the people, the people who make up the society, the leaders can't act in isolation. The leaders can't act against the generality of the people that they are leading. So those people who are in the army of Ahmad Shah Durrani, the Muslims that were in his army, when they were told to go into Delhi and kill their Muslim brothers and sisters and loot and pillage, why did they refuse? So this is a general malaise. It can't be blamed on one particular individual or another, but it was a general sickness now in the body of the Muslims by this time. What else? I think the last point I would like to make, something that really stood out for me in this book, is the Mughal Emperor during this time, during most of this time, during a lot of the time that he talks about in the book, is an emperor who by the name of Shah Alam. So Shah Alam is the Mughal Emperor, and his life is really such a tragic, heroic story, that we really, as Muslims, we need to really be re-embracing our history and rediscovering these type of people. So Shah Alam, this Mughal Emperor, he's one of the most, how can you put it? One of those people that is the most tested in this world. So he became emperor at a time when the Mughal Empire is in complete decline, almost in complete pieces. But he's a noble character. He is a brave warrior. He is an intelligent and literate person. He's a poet. He writes poetry. He even has books published of his poetry. And he's a tall, muscular, handsome man. And he's first into battle when that is required. But it was his destiny that he's born into this time when the Mughal Empire is in complete pieces, and he basically, spends years wandering around India because he's been exiled from Delhi, and but then people gather around him. Many people come to form an army around him, and so the book also follows his life journey through various ups and downs. He ends up back in Delhi, but he's really like a puppet ruler of the Hindu Marathas to begin with. Later on, he is also blinded and tortured within Delhi, within the Red Fort. He's tortured by another Muslim forces once again. He's tortured, imprisoned, chained up. His women are dishonored and abused in a horrible way. So he is put through all of this. He's literally blinded as well. It's so tragic, but it's so amazing and beautiful the way that he keeps his sabr. And if you read some of the poems, the Dalrymple quotes some of the poetry he wrote at that time as well. about how he's not complaining, and he's talking about how temporary this life is, and so on. So it's a story of great patience, sabr in the face of affliction and trials and tribulations that can inspire all of us. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make our trials and tribulations easy for us in this world, and may He make us people of sabr and shukr during our time of tribulations. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us understanding of this deen and have mercy on the ummah of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam and Muslims wherever they are. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.